Welcome, everyone. I'm Dr. Donald Wallenfang, Associate Professor of Theology here at Walsh University. I welcome you to this first lecture of Theology 106 online. It's a pleasure to be with you. And the title of the first lecture is called Faith and Reason. So we want to get right away into the heart of the content of theology, which asks the question of God through both reason and faith in God's revelation about God's self. So the first thing I want to point out here on the whiteboard is the concept of theology. With the concept of theology, we see two words within it, going back to the original Greek. So the first word is theos, and theos in Greek means God. So theology has something to do with God, with theos. And the second part of the word theology is from the Greek word logos, which we find in so many other words like biology, physiology, sociology, psychology. Anything that ends with the suffix ology is from this Greek word logos. And logos in Greek means, you could say, the study of something, meaning about something, words about something. And we could also say the science about something. In this case, the science of God. So theology is the science of God, the science that has God as its primary object of study. So we're thinking about theology, we're thinking about questions of God through the concepts of faith and also reason. Faith and reason. We're going to approach the question of God through both faith and reason. Reason may be a concept more familiar to you, and reason has to do with observations about nature, the natural order, observations about nature. Also, reason has a lot to do with what is called philosophy. And so we first of all ask the question of God. Does God exist? Is God real? Through reason, through philosophy, and based on our observations of nature. This is where we're going to begin in this class. And once we've taken a lot of time to ask the question of God through reason, we also are going to ask the question of God through the stuff of faith. And what we mean by faith, the data for faith, is the stuff of what's called divine revelation. That is, God's revelation of God's very self to us personal creatures, as human beings. And so we have a whole history of God's revelation. We have many religious traditions that talk about God's revelation. For our purposes, we're staying primarily within the Catholic theological tradition. God's revelation, first of all, through the Jewish people, the stuff of the Hebrew scriptures, or what Christianity calls the Old Testament, through all of the prophets, the covenant relationships. And we're going to talk about that in upcoming weeks. But for now, we're just dealing with the basic concept of divine revelation. Divine revelation for Catholic belief is through two fronts, two basic sources of divine revelation for us human beings to this day. And the two sources are, first of all, Scripture, this textual witness to God's revelation throughout human history, the Old and New Testaments. And second, for a Catholic understanding of divine revelation, we also have the living tradition of the church. The Greek word is paradosis. Paradosis, this handing on of God's revelation through, first of all, an oral tradition, things like liturgy and the sacraments and the creeds, all these other things that form the faith in addition to Scripture, and even that which Scripture is dependent on. So there are these certain books of the Bible, but we ask who decided what these books would be. It's the living teaching authority of the church, invested in the bishops of the church going back to the apostles. So here are some preliminary concepts for us in theology, and this is a good place to begin. And next lecture, we're going to talk about proof that God is real, proof that God exists. One of the preambles of faith, that God exists. And we're going to begin with reason and philosophical argument based on our observations of nature to demonstrate that God is real, that God exists. So stay tuned for our next lecture. And for now, we're going to exit our first lecture and prepare for the second.